I was asked to say a few words to introduce this particular session on the importance of creative education. That's been a bit of a thing of mine for quite a long time. I didn't start out with a particular or separate interest in creative education. My interest initially when I got into education was more focused on the arts. Now I say that because a lot of people conflate creativity with the arts. You know, the arts are very important in education, and I'm a lifelong advocate of their importance and have done all I've been able to do to promote them and to try and secure better provision. I have to say it's always in the face of a prevailing headwind because of many misconceptions about the arts. But creativity is not a synonym for the arts. Creativity ranges much more broadly across the whole of the curriculum, which is what I want to say a few words about. But incidentally, getting creativity higher up the agenda in education also confronts various obstacles. You know, I was asked, well, it's now almost 20 years ago, by the then British government to put together a national strategy for creative education. And I did that by convening a group of tremendous people who had a lot of expertise in different forms of creative work, or I should say in different disciplines. The background to that very briefly was that in the UK at the time we had a national literacy strategy and a national strategy for numeracy. And Tony Blair, who was then the Prime Minister, kept making speeches shortly after he was elected, about the importance of creativity in schools as well. Well, quite a few of us at the time, we agreed that creativity should be very much higher up the agenda for education, but we couldn't see that the policies the government was proposing to put in place were going to do anything to encourage it. Well, we believed that they were acting in good faith, and so a group of us approached the then administration and said, look, if you're serious about creativity, be serious about it. We have a literacy strategy, we have a numeracy strategy, let's have a creativity strategy. Well, you know how these things run. If you put your head above the parapet and shout loud enough, eventually somebody takes you to one side and says, okay, you do it. Well, I was invited to do it, and I did do it with a whole group of people. I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute. And we did develop a national strategy. If you're interested in taking a look at it, it's called All Our Futures: Creativity, Culture and Education. And there's a link at the end of this video which will take you to a version of it. One of the obstacles in putting this together was the various misconceptions about creativity, about what it is and why it matters. I remember the then Secretary of State for Education, who commissioned the report, saying to me before the commission got underway that, of course, one of the problems with creativity is you can't define it. And I wasn't being specious when I said, you know, I think the problem is you can't. And I meant that seriously, because if you don't have a definition of creativity, you're led into all kinds of myths and misconceptions about it. There are three related terms which I think it's important to both distinguish and connect when we start to think about creativity in education. The three terms are imagination, creativity, and innovation. You know, they can be used interchangeably, but I think it's wrong to do that because they do point to different core ideas. Imagination, for me, is where this all begins. Imagination is the wellspring of creativity. So if we're interested to cultivate creativity, we have to begin by stimulating and creating conditions for stimulating our natural powers of imagination. Imagination, as I conceive of it, and I'm not alone in conceiving it this way, but at least let me put a stake in the ground here. Imagination is the ability to bring into mind things that aren't present to our senses. With imagination, you can visit the past in your mind's eye. And interestingly, of course, the past isn't a settled domain. It's why history is such a fascinating discipline. The past is open constantly to interpretation and reinterpretation as we apply different filters to it. But with imagination, you can cast your mind backwards into the past. You can cast it forward into the future. You can anticipate, you can hypothesize, you can speculate. You can't always predict very comfortably, particularly not in the world of human affairs, certainly not as comfortably as you can in the natural sciences, but you can anticipate and speculate. With imagination, you can look into other people's points of view. You can try and see the world as they do. Imagination for human beings, at any rate, is one of the seats of empathy and compassion. It's the capacity to see the world as others might see it, to feel as they might feel. Creativity is a step on. Creativity is putting your imagination to work. It's applied imagination. You see, to be creative, you have to do something. To dwell in your imagination, you don't. You can be imaginative all day long and never do anything. You could be lying in bed, having a wonderful imaginative time, but it may never result in anything in the external world. Creativity has outcomes in the public arena. And the point about creativity is that it is an applied process, and we know quite a bit about how it works and the conditions under which it flourishes. Innovation, then, is putting good ideas into practice. So these three terms, imagination, creativity, and innovation, are central to a strategy for creative education. Now, there are various myths about creativity. One of them is that only special people are creative. That's simply not true. If you're a human being, the powers you need come with the kit. We have immense natural capacities for imagination as human beings, and enormously varied and sophisticated potential for creativity. I say potential because creativity is not just a set of capacities, it depends on a very wide-ranging set of practical abilities, and we don't all cultivate them, we don't all develop them in the way that we might. So one misconception is about special people. It isn't. Obviously some people have particular creative gifts in different domains, but we all have creative capacity. A second misconception is that creativity is about special things. If you ask people if they're creative, very many people will say they're not. And I think it's because what they think you ask them is whether they're artistic. Well, as I say, we can be tremendously creative in the arts, but you can be creative in anything. You can be creative in mathematics, in technology, you can be creative in running or planning a business, you can be creative in cuisine, you can be creative in the way you teach, you can be creative in anything, whatever, that engages human intelligence and imagination. It's not a set of capacities that's limited to one activity or another. So when we come to think about creativity in schools, it's for everybody and it's everything. It's the whole curriculum and everybody in the school. It's not just for a few people that we identify with particular talents. There's a third misconception about creativity, which is it's all about freedom. I was reading an article 2 days ago in The Economist, and they raised this old chestnut that some people who advocate for creativity seem to think it's something that is antipathetic to discipline or learning propositional information, facts and other sorts of propositions. Of course it's not. You can't be creative, for example, on a musical instrument if you can't play it. Now, there are issues of pedagogy here, but I don't play the piano and I can't be creative on the piano. I can have some kind of emotional release by banging on the keys, but that's not to be compared with the sort of creative work that could be produced by people with a sophisticated set of skills and understanding about how the instrument works and how music works. It's not possible to be, in the end, creative in every way that we might want to promote in mathematics if you're enumerate. So creativity is not the opposite. It's not antipathetic to skills or understanding of particular disciplines. In fact, it depends upon them. And people can become more creative as they become more adept in the skills and media on which creative work depends. And there's a fourth myth, which is that creativity can't be taught. Well, it can. There's a longer way of putting this, but as time is short, it can. It depends how we think of teaching. If we think of teaching only in terms of of direct instruction or conveying propositional knowledge, well, you don't teach creativity in that direct way. But there is very long experience in many disciplines of the truth of the ability to cultivate the conditions under which people can become more creative, to help them develop the skills, the attitudes, the frames of mind upon which creative work flourishes. So let me define. I said earlier that the Secretary of State thought it was hard to define creativity. It's not easy, but let me tell you how I define it. And this is a definition that came in part through the work of the commission we had in the UK. Creativity, as we define it, is the process of having original ideas that have value. The process of having original ideas that have value. These three things are important. It's a process, it's not an event. Much more often, creative work evolves in the making of it. It's a conversation between the material and the idea. And often the idea that we end up with, or the piece of work we end up with during the course of a creative process, is not the one that we had in mind when we started out. It's an evolutionary process. And it often depends on false starts, on going down cul-de-sacs, on having to back up, on failures of various sorts, on unfulfilled ideas that really didn't take you where you thought they might go. So it's a process. It's about original thinking. Now, it's important to say this too, that it doesn't have to be original to the entire world, but it has to be original at least to you. It has to put your mind into a different shape as a consequence. You know, it would be unreasonable, wouldn't it, to look at the drawings of a 5-year-old child and say, well, we've all seen this type of thing before, you know, or point to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and say, look, check this out, you know, come back when you've got something worth looking at. It has to at least be original to the person doing it. It may be original to the community in which they work, and of course, it may also be original to the whole of humanity. But it has to have an element of originality about it. And the third element is value. And what this means is that creative work has to have some purpose which is worthwhile. Now, immediately, of course, people say, well, when you say value, whose values do you have in mind? Well, that's the whole point. The first thing is to say that the creative process isn't just coming up with new ideas, it's also applying critical judgments to the ideas you're developing. If you're writing a book, or writing a poem, or composing a theorem, or coming up with a recipe, whatever you're doing when you're trying to come up with something fresh and original, there's a constant process of interrogation which wraps itself around it, saying, is this worthwhile? Is this working? You see it all the time in writers' drafts. You know, words are crossed out, it wasn't quite right. You see it in the early sketches of paintings, you see it in work in science. Is this right? Does it feel right? Is it moving in the right direction? So creative work isn't just about coming up with fresh ideas, it's also judging whether these are any good. And of course, a lot of work in the past has been judged to be worthless simply because, well, I say simply, but because the wrong criteria have been applied to them. You know, in 1939, the World's Fair was held in Flushing Meadow in New York, and the exhibits included the first practical demonstration of a commercial system of television. One of the papers at the time commented wryly on this, that it was a very interesting innovation, but that it simply wouldn't catch on. It said that television will never replace the radio in America. And they said it's perfectly clear why not, because when you're listening to the radio, you can get on and do other things, whereas to experience television, you have to sit immobilized in a chair staring at a screen, you know, which became the very attraction of the entire system, the sitting immobile in a chair part. Well, you know, they said the average American family simply doesn't have time for this. Well, it turns out they did. The average American family these days spends upwards of 20 hours a week sitting in front of this useless gadget. The point is that this innovation was being judged within contemporary cultural values, and television, like many great technological innovations, didn't simply insert itself silently into the culture, it transformed the culture as a whole. Innovation has to be judged by appropriate values, and judging what those values are is part of the process of creative education. Well, why does all this matter? Creative education is important for personal reasons. Creativity is what sets us apart from the rest of life on Earth. Very little does, but we don't live as other creatures do. We mistake, I think, our relationship with the natural world, and we should reconnect it more thoroughly than we have done. But human beings never live just as other creatures do. We create virtual worlds. We live in a world of theories. We live in worlds of ideas, of multiple languages. We live in systems of belief. We live in great cities. We live in a world that's been shaped by technology. We live, in other words, within cultures. We create the world that we live in, and when we create them together, we create cultural ways of seeing. Creativity is at the very heart and pulse of humanity. And if we're concerned with an education system or developing an education system that cultivates the essential characteristics of humanity, then we have to take creativity to the heart of education. It's vitally important for economic reasons. This is one of the reasons why there's been this great movement for reform across the world, particularly, sadly, through standardization and testing. But innovation is at the heart of our economies, and economies won't succeed unless we look at the multiple forms that innovation takes and create the capacities for innovation that come from the developed abilities in creative work. And creativity is at the very center of our cultural lives, the lives of our communities. It's represented not just in the arts, but certainly in the arts. It's represented in the humanities, in our architecture, in our ways of being together, in our civic institutions. And many of these need to be reformed and rethought now. So creativity, properly conceived, is at the very heart of what it is to be an educated person. It's the very heart of what it is to be a civilized community. And if those things matter to us, then they should be at the heart of how we run our education systems. Well, how's it done? Let me headline a few things. It's about the curriculum. It's about seeing creativity at the center of all disciplines, and of all disciplines interconnecting with each other. It should be at the heart of our teaching. There's a difference between teaching with creativity and teaching for creativity. By teaching with creativity, I mean encouraging teachers themselves to use their creative powers and abilities to make education more engaging, to make lessons more interesting, to provoke and inspire children's curiosity. But there are also things to be learnt about how you encourage other people to be creative, and that's what teaching for creativity is. And this is a matter of professional development. We need assessment systems which recognise that creative work doesn't have a single or predictable set of outcomes very often. One of the people on the committee I mentioned earlier, the All Our Futures Committee, was Professor Sir Harry Kroto, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. I asked Sir Harry how many of his experiments failed. And he said, well, most of them, like most scientists, most of our experiments failed. He said, certainly 90% of them. But he said, failure isn't really the right word here. If you're on the track of something original, if you're trying to come up with fresh ideas, then you're bound along the way to discover many things that don't work before you discover what does work. And that's true in every creative process. It's iterative. There are many false starts, many dead ends, many cul-de-sacs, many failed attempts. And if we have an education system that's predicated on assessment systems that only tolerate getting the right answer the first time or giving you a choice of 4, you already have built in a contradiction in the system itself to the promotion of the creative powers that we want to celebrate and cultivate. And it's about partnership. Schools shouldn't live in an oasis. They should be connected with all the cultural resources available within the district and within the community more largely. Creativity is very often a collaborative process as much as it is an individual process. So these areas of curriculum, teaching, assessment and school culture are all relevant to the proper promotion of creativity across our education systems. I'm convinced that we have all the resources we need in our schools, among our teachers and in our communities to transform education through a more creative approach to teaching and learning. We need to be creative in how we teach, we need to be creative in how we run our systems, and all of these things should be in interest of helping children themselves to become more creative. I'm always reminded, of a short poem that was attributed to the writer Anais Nin. And it's very short, and it's called Risk. And she says of her own creative journey, she became a writer a little later in her life, and reflected on the frustration she felt when she hadn't found this creative outlet that became so transformative for her. She said, "There came a time when the risk of remaining tight in a bud was greater than the risk it took to blossom. And I think this is very important because there is tremendous talent locked up in our schools, in our teachers, in our students, in the community, and in the administration of our systems. And it's often the case that it takes more effort to contain all this talent than it would to release it. And if we were to release it, we'd see a harvest of achievement that we can't fully anticipate, but we can absolutely depend upon. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you a little later on.